In the 1930s, an almost unbelievable cast of characters converged around one of the strangest chapters in the history of pseudo-archaeology. A gay, left-leaning historian, a circle of fanatical Nazi ideologues, and a centuries-old medieval poem all became entangled in a search for the Holy Grail. And while it sounds like the premise of an adventure film, this pursuit was deadly serious to the people involved. And it was only the first of several bizarre, state-funded expeditions the Third Reich launched in an attempt to prove its warped racial mythology. The story begins with Otto Rahn, a gifted young scholar who completed his history degree at just 20 years old in 1924 and quickly became consumed by a singular obsession. Locating the Holy Grail, the vessel Christian tradition holds was used by Christ at the Last Supper, an object whose very existence most historians doubt, but which Rahn was convinced had survived into the modern era, hidden and waiting to be discovered. Rahn believed that the medieval epic poem Parzival contained coded clues pointing to the Grail's resting place, and this conviction sent him on his first expedition to the former mountain strongholds of the Cathars in southern France, a Christian sect that had been wiped out centuries earlier. He returned empty-handed, but he wrote a book chronicling the journey, and that book caught the eye of Heinrich Himmler, the SS chief whose fascination with the Grail rivaled Rahn's own. Himmler decided that this brilliant young historian, despite his open contempt for Nazi ideology, was exactly the kind of mind needed to finally track down the relic. And Rahn, driven by his fixation and perhaps blind to the danger of what he was doing, joined the Nazi Party in the early 1930s so the SS would bankroll a second expedition back to the Cathar ruins. That expedition also failed to turn up anything, though Rahn produced another book from it, and while Himmler admired the writing, he was reportedly enraged by the lack of results and punished Rahn by assigning him to a brutal post as a guard at the Dachau concentration camp in 1937. 2 years later, having resigned from the party, Rahn was found frozen to death in the Alps, in what is widely believed to have been a suicide, and his death did not end Himmler's fixation on the Grail. Himmler had also come to believe, in defiance of basic historical fact, that Jesus, a Jewish man born to Jewish parents, was somehow racially Aryan, and in 1940 he personally traveled to the monastery of Montserrat near Barcelona with an SS escort to interrogate the monks there about what they might know of the Grail's location, convinced that references in Parzival pointed to that very mountain. The monks dismissed his theories outright, and after making a donation toward repairing a local well, likely an attempt to curry favor with Spain's fascist dictator Francisco Franco and pull him into the war on Germany's side, Himmler left with nothing. The Nazis never found the Holy Grail, and to this day its location and even its existence remains unresolved. Roughly around the same period, deep in Germany's Teutoburg forest, a formation of towering sandstone pillars known as the Externsteine became the target of Nazi pseudo-scientific attention. Some researchers had speculated the rocks once served as a prehistoric observatory, while others believed they held spiritual significance for ancient Germanic peoples. But it wasn't until the 20th century that the site was seized upon by a much darker institution, the Ahnenerbe, a research bureau founded by Himmler in 1935 under the SS, whose stated purpose was to study and promote what the regime considered the ancient heritage of the so-called Aryan race. In practice, the Ahnenerbe existed to manufacture pseudo-historical justification for Nazi racial ideology, twisting archaeology, anthropology, and folklore to fit a predetermined narrative, and the Externsteine became one of its most notorious targets. Building on old regional legends, Himmler and his team of in-house scholars claimed the rock formation had once been the site of Irminsul, a sacred pillar or world tree venerated by the ancient Saxons, said to have been destroyed by Charlemagne during his forced Christianization campaigns around 772 AD. And they insisted that carvings on the stones depicted the destruction of that sacred site. The Saxons, remembered as a fiercely independent people who resisted conversion for generations, were recast by the Nazis as ancestral exemplars of Aryan racial purity and warrior spirit. And the Ahnenerbe's project at the Externsteine was explicitly about reclaiming the site as a symbol of a supposedly unbroken Germanic lineage, a narrative so effective that Nazi youth groups were reportedly made to sing pagan-themed hymns there on Hitler's birthday. The actual history of the Externsteine tells a far more layered story. The rock formations themselves are around 70 million years old. Archaeological evidence suggests nomadic hunter-gatherers sheltered there as far back as roughly 10,000 BC, and Christian monks may have carved out living spaces in the rock as early as the 8th or 9th century, though much of the documentary record from the medieval period was destroyed during the Second World War. What does survive includes a striking 12th century relief carving depicting the descent of Christ from the cross, and over the following centuries, the site was used variously as a hermitage and reportedly as a hideout for bandits before a 19th century wave of romantic nationalism revived interest in its supposed ancient significance. Today, mainstream historians largely reject any genuine connection between the Externsteine and the Irminsul legend, but the fabricated narrative the Ahnenerbe constructed still lingers, drawing modern Nazi sympathizers and some neo-pagan groups to the site even now. Nazi obsession with manufacturing a mythic Aryan past didn't stop at Germany's borders. In the summer of 1936, an SS-backed expedition ventured into the remote forests of Karelia, a wilderness straddling the border of Finland and Russia, long associated in folklore with sorcery and ancient tradition. The expedition was led by Eir von Grönhagen, a young Finnish nobleman whose fascination with the region's folk magic had drawn Himmler's attention, since Himmler believed Karelia might preserve fragments of lost Aryan knowledge useful to reinforcing the regime's ideology. Grönhagen's assignment was to record the ritual chants and incantations still practiced by Karelian elders who maintained pre-Christian customs, and he was joined by Fritz Bose, a Nazi musicologist, along with a Finnish illustrator, the team carrying a cutting-edge piece of technology for the time, an early tape recorder known as a magnetophone. Their travels brought them to isolated villages where they encountered people living in ways that felt almost untouched by the modern world, including an elderly man named Tamo Lisitsa near the village of Suge, a man who, by his own account, had never seen a train or set foot in a school. Persuaded by Grönhagen, Lisitsa sang ancient songs handed down through generations, weaving a creation narrative echoing themes found in Finland's national epic. The Kalevala and Grönhagen's team recorded every note, viewing the songs not merely as folklore, but as potential clues to a deeper, mythologized Aryan origin story. The most haunting encounter of the trip came near the village of Suistamo, where Grönhagen sought out a 92-year-old woman named Tiwanaku, known locally as a healer or seer, whom villagers had warned him to avoid. He found her gathering mushrooms in the forest, and she told him she had dreamed of his arrival 3 days earlier and understood he had come seeking her secrets. Reluctantly, she performed a ritual meant to summon the spirits of her ancestors, but when the recording was played back to her, she reportedly became distressed, believing that capturing her sacred chant on tape had violated something sacred and stripped her of her spiritual power. By the end of the summer, Grönhagen's team had gathered more than 100 recordings, material that Himmler and the SS in Berlin saw not as an ethnographic curiosity, but as potential evidence supporting their fantasy of a hidden Aryan heritage. The regime's search for a usable ancient pedigree eventually stretched all the way to the Himalayas. On a cold morning in January 1939, 5 young European men in Western clothing arrived in the Tibetan capital of Lhasa, a striking sight against the backdrop of the city's streets, and though they presented themselves as friendly visitors who paid respect to local leaders and mingled easily with residents, they were in fact operating on behalf of Heinrich Himmler. The expedition's leader, Ernst Scheffer, had first connected with the Nazi regime years earlier when his passion for scientific exploration attracted SS funding. And although Scheffer himself showed little genuine interest in Nazi ideology, the promise of resources for expeditions was enough to secure his cooperation. Officially, the mission was framed as a scientific and anthropological survey, tasked with documenting Tibet's plants, animals, and people. But underneath that academic cover lay the regime's real motive. Certain Nazi theorists believed Tibet might hold clues to the mythical origins of the Aryan race, and Scheffer's team was directed to collect anthropological data, including physical measurements and facial casts of Tibetan people, in a misguided search for evidence to support these racial theories. There was also a strategic, geopolitical angle to the mission, since Himmler recognized Tibet's position in Central Asia and hoped that establishing ties there could support anti-British sentiment in the region and potentially open the door to aligning Tibet with the Axis powers. British authorities in India, wary of Nazi intentions, initially blocked the expedition from crossing into their territory, but through diplomatic maneuvering Scheffer's team managed to enter the semi-autonomous region of Sikkim in 1938, which opened the route into Tibet itself. Over the following year, the team traveled extensively through Sikkim and Tibet, documenting everything from local customs to natural history, and they took particular note of the widespread use of the swastika in Tibetan culture, where it functioned as a traditional symbol of good fortune, a symbol the Nazi regime had appropriated and twisted for its own purposes. By the time the expedition returned to Germany in 1939, the team had collected a large trove of specimens, measurements, and illustrations, and Scheffer's presentation of these findings so impressed Himmler that he began imagining a follow-up mission that would return to Tibet to help organize an anti-British force capable of challenging colonial power in India. That plan never came to pass, but Scheffer was nonetheless rewarded with his own dedicated department inside the Ahnenerbe in 1943. A final expedition took the Nazi obsession with racial origin myths across the Atlantic to South America, where in 1928, a German traveler named Edmund Kiss arrived at the ancient ruins of Tiwanaku in present-day Bolivia. Kiss was not an ordinary tourist. He was chasing evidence for a fringe scientific theory that had consumed him, the so-called world ice theory, a pseudo-scientific idea developed by Hans Herbiger, which claimed that Earth's history had been shaped by catastrophic collisions with orbiting ice moons. Tiwanaku, with its massive stone monoliths, some blocks reportedly weighing hundreds of tons, and its intricate carvings, had long fascinated archaeologists and explorers, and Kiss believed the site could serve as physical proof of Herbiger's cosmic catastrophe theory. Before his trip, Kiss had reached out to Arthur Posnansky, an Austrian expatriate living in Bolivia who had spent years studying the ruins, and who controversially argued that Tiwanaku's builders were not indigenous South Americans at all, but mysterious outsiders who had arrived from far away. A civilization, he speculated, based on his own astronomical interpretations of the site, might date back as far as 177,000 years. Funded by winnings from a writing contest, Kiss spent months at the ruins sketching floor plans and studying the carvings, and he became particularly fixated on a carved stone head that he insisted displayed distinctly Nordic facial features, an observation he used to bolster his belief that the site reflected a superior Aryan influence rather than indigenous craftsmanship. He also claimed to identify European-style architectural elements at the site, including what he described as Baroque-style doorways and Greek cross motifs, dismissing outright the possibility that local indigenous cultures could have engineered something so sophisticated, a conclusion rooted far more in racial bias than in genuine archaeological evidence. Kiss became especially preoccupied with the site's famous Gate of the Sun, which Posnansky had proposed functioned as an ancient calendar, and Kiss developed an elaborate interpretation in which the carvings represented a calendar system of 12 months made up of 24 or 25 days each, with each day divided into 30 hours, a structure he took as further confirmation of the world ice theory's validity. From this, he concluded that Tiwanaku must be almost inconceivably ancient, constructed under entirely different celestial conditions produced by a moon orbiting the Earth far more rapidly than our current one. Kiss's conclusions were enthusiastically published in Nazi Party newspapers, where they fit neatly into the regime's broader racist historical narrative, and with SS backing, he began planning a return expedition to Tiwanaku in 1938. But the outbreak of the Second World War brought those plans to a halt, and the eventual collapse of the Third Reich left his theories discredited and relegated to the margins of serious historical and archaeological scholarship. Taken together, these episodes, the hunt for the Grail in southern France and Spain, the manufactured mythology of the Externsteine, the recordings gathered in the forests of Karelia, the anthropological mission to Tibet, and the pseudo-archaeological expedition to Tiwanaku, reveal a regime that was willing to pour state resources into elaborate, pseudoscientific quests in order to manufacture historical legitimacy for an ideology built on racial supremacy. And while none of these missions produced anything close to what the Nazis were hoping to find, they left behind a troubling record of how easily genuine scholars, folklore, and archaeological sites could be co-opted and distorted in service of a dangerous political project. A cautionary history worth remembering not for its strangeness alone, but for what it reveals about the lengths a totalitarian regime will go to invent the past it wants rather than accept the one that actually happened.